Hi, everyone. Welcome to Disgorged Online. I'm Zach Jabal. I am a wine professional. I am the producer and co-host of the Vine Pair podcast. I also write about wine for Vine Pair and 750 Daily, some other publications. And back when there were restaurants open in the United States, I was the wine educator for Tom Douglas Restaurants here in Seattle. Trying something a little bit new today, so we're doing this on the YouTube stream as always, and I'm also on Instagram Live. Hopefully this goes off without too many hitches, but things should go okay. We're going to be covering today, we're going to be looking at Chenin Blanc, and specifically Vouvray. I am drinking the Domaine Pichot from Vouvray in the Loire Valley in France, but if you are drinking something else, please feel free to let me know what that might be. On YouTube, you can leave it in the comments. I think on Instagram, you can message it to me if you want. I have no idea how that works. First time. Patrick, happy birthday. Thanks for joining. Hope you're enjoying something delicious to celebrate. And let's go ahead and get started here. So let's start with Chenin Blanc. So Chenin is kind of one of these interesting varieties where it was definitely not necessarily... It was out of favor for a long time. And a lot of that has to do with, when we covered Riesling a couple of episodes ago, a lot of the same factors that really hurt Riesling have also hurt Chenin Blanc. And a lot of that is just the preponderance of what was available, in particular in the United States, was sweet. And the preference for sweet wine really kind of dried up in this country. I guess that's a pun. I wasn't even intending it. In the 60s and 70s, as people started looking for drier styles of wine, and the sort of what was available in the U.S. From Vouvray was sweet, or at least off dry. And that doesn't mean that the bulk of what was made in Vouvray and the rest of the Loire Valley from Chenin Blanc was necessarily sweet, but that's what importers had to bring into the U.S., and it really kind of ruined the reputation of the variety in a lot of ways. And so for a newer generation of drinker, and given what's in the market now, it's actually, I think, a little uncommon to confront a truly sweet style of Chenin Blanc from France. They do exist for sure, but I think more and more often what you're finding from the Loire, whether from Vouvray or some of the other appellations that I'll talk about in a little bit, tends to be quite dry. So what do I like about Vouvray and about Chenin Blanc? First and foremost, I'm a fan of wines that can deliver relatively high, white wines in particular, that can deliver high acidity or relatively high acidity, but still have a fair bit of complexity. And that can be a challenge with some varieties. Sometimes complexity comes at the expense of acidity, or high acidity goes with a kind of simple quaffing wine. But Chenin Blanc and Vouvray are a variety and an origin point for the wine that can deliver both complexity of flavor and aroma along with a lot of acidity. Other notes that I really like, so along with that, the wine doesn't tend to have a pronounced green character, which some people like, but I don't tend to enjoy in my white wines, with some exceptions. So some other varieties that could deliver more of that same acidity with some complexity, but might have more green notes, things like Sauvignon Blanc, even Gruner Veltliner, are not necessarily my preference, but I do really enjoy that Vouvray and other Chenin Blancs can deliver, like I said, that acidity without the green. And then the last note is that often with Vouvray and some of its other sort of sister wines from the Loire, you do get a little bit of an oxidative note, and I'll go into what that means in a little bit. And I think when made well and when balanced properly, those oxidative notes can be really tasty and really enjoyable. And Chenin Blanc as a variety tends to have fruit characteristics in particular that hold up well in that context. Okay, so then let's talk about a little bit what you might be experiencing with your Chenin Blanc wines. So in the glass, I think you can get, even with specifically Vouvray, there's actually a pretty wide range, and it's hard sometimes to narrow down. And the two main determining factors that go into kind of figuring out what you might be getting in the glass are, first and foremost, how much sweetness there might be on the wine. A sweeter style can often, although not always, also sort of show more ripe fruit character. So the really dry styles of Chenin Blanc might lean on really kind of tart tree fruit notes. So green apple, green pear, you might get some citrus for sure. Could be like a really, not necessarily lemon, more of a tangerine or orange, but it's going to still be on the tart side. And then definitely a little bit of sort of that a note of oxidation. Often kind of apple cider is a note that I get on the really dry styles of Vouvray. Mine here, and the wine in my glass is little bit off dry for sure. So I'm getting a little bit more of those sort of ripe citrus notes. Again, really kind of assertive tangerine and orange. There's definitely a note of apple, but it's a little bit riper apple. And there's just like a little hint of kind of a peachy, yeah, kind of like a peach character, maybe even a little bit of like some other kind of riper stone fruit. So maybe even like a little nectarine or something like that. There's also a little bit of florality to these wines. So a little chamomile, orange blossom, those kinds of things. And then the last sort of big differentiating factor with these wines, whether they're Vouvray or from somewhere else in the Loire, is whether there's any impact from botrytis on the wine. And so I think I mentioned botrytis again when we were talking Riesling a couple of episodes ago, but I'll just go back into that really quickly because it's really often central to these wines. So botrytis is a fungus essentially that infects grapes, and there's a whole range of them, but Botrytis cinerea, which is the kind of the one that's considered noble rot and is actually desirable in some cases, not all cases, produces both a sort of dehydrating effect on the grapes. So it sort of removes some of the water, which concentrates the flavors, and it does kind of affect the flavor as well. It lends a sort of ginger, honey, saffron character to the wine. There's definitely some botrytis on this wine. There's definitely a sort of a ginger honey note. And this is 2018, so that honey character might also come with white wine with a lot of age, but this is a quite young wine. So generally, if you're getting that honeyed flavor in a young wine, you're probably getting the hint of botrytis or a lot of botrytis, depending on the wine. I don't think this has a ton of it. It's not super intense. It's just there. The other big thing to take note of on these wines is as you transition from smelling the wine to tasting the wine, you may or may not find that sort of fruit profile really shifts dramatically. So you might see with, again, the really dry styles that you're moving from maybe some even generous notes of ripe citrus, tree fruits into a really kind of leaner, more tart fruit profile. Whereas, as in the case with this one, with a little bit more of that residual sugar, those off-dry notes, I think you're getting a little more maintaining that sort of riper citrus, riper tree fruit character. The other thing that I pick up on the palate more than I pick up on the nose, and it's often the case, is there is that hint of oxidation. And so with white wines, that often manifests itself as kind of a nuttiness. To me, there's a very kind of almond, almost like an almond skin character to this wine. Hazelnuts as well, kind of another one that I often pick up. And it plays out as almost like a little bit of bitterness on the finish that comes from that sort of oxidation and the way that the wine presents itself. And it's that same kind of, just kind of bitter nuttiness that you expect from tasting those nuts. And then finally, talking about sort of the structure of the wine here. I mean, one universal with Chenin Blanc is that it's going to have high acid. It's just the variety as a whole, as I mentioned at the top, brings a lot of acidity to the party, and that high level of acid is really pretty much, like I said, it's hard to not find it. There's some exceptions, but it's pretty common, especially from the Loire Valley, but even from other parts of the world. And then usually kind of moderate levels of alcohol. I would say this isn't often a wine that you're going to get a lot of alcohol in. There are a few exceptions, but it's pretty rare. And then the wine tends to be pretty lean, with the caveat that if you're drinking a version with a fair bit of residual sugar, you might be getting a little bit more structure, or a little more body, I should say, that the actual weight of the sugar in the wine is going to lend it a little bit more body. And you can also get a little bit of that weight from botrytis. So if you're getting both of those things in the wine, it can come off as a little bit richer, especially on the initial palate impression, but it should still finish pretty clean and lean with all that acid. And that's one of the reasons why these off-dry styles can work really nicely is they have that high level of acid where the sweetness is apparent at the sort of initial impression on your palate, but it isn't cloying. It doesn't sort of stick with you. It is, kind of washed away by this acid towards the finish of the taste. Okay, so let's shift our focus specifically to the Loire Valley. For those of you who aren't familiar, so the Loire is a region in the western part of France. It's beautiful. There's a lot of history there. When you sort of think about the really famous chateaux of France, many of them are in the Loire Valley, and there's not just the Loire River itself, but a sort of series of rivers that are tributaries or that branch off from it that are sort of the center of the wine regions that are throughout the valley, which is quite large and spans from the Atlantic all the way kind of into the middle of France. Vouvray, as I mentioned, and its sort of neighbor Montlouis-sur-Loire are one of the main hubs for Chenin Blanc production. But there are some other regions as well. Savinière, which is to the west, close to Anjou, and then the Saumur region as well. With in particular, I would want to emphasize the commune of Brezay as being kind of a source for particularly good Chenin Blanc. And I'll dive a little bit into those as we kind of wrap things up here to talk about maybe some of the differences and some producers to look for. Because I will say that with Chenin Blanc in the Loire, it is definitely a situation where you want to have some familiarity with the producer if you're just buying a bottle, because the styles can be pretty divergent. And there's some great wines. There's some also kind of mediocre wines that are out there, unfortunately. The other place in the world that's really actually pretty cool for Sauvignon Blanc, for Chenin Blanc, is South Africa, and it has a long history in South Africa. I couldn't tell you exactly how it is that it became the dominant white variety there, but it really is. It's been widely planted. There's actually more Chenin Blanc planted in South Africa than there is in France. It's the largest producer of Chenin Blanc in the world. Some places will still use the sort of traditional Afrikaans name for it, which is Steen, Steen. But most producers these days, pretty much anyone who's exporting their wine, is going to be doing it under the name Chenin Blanc, because that's what is sort of globally recognized as the variety. So there's definitely a lot of production in South Africa. There's a fair bit of it planted in California, but it's becoming less and less common. A lot of producers have pulled out the vines or are pulling them out. Here in Washington, there's a little bit as well, although again, was a lot of early plantings in the early days of Washington, but it's really kind of declined in its prominence. There's a few producers here who still are really committed to it, but it's not a lot. And the same is true for other pockets of the world. There's some in South America, in particular in Argentina, but it's not widely planted a lot of places. Although you might be seeing that change as the world kind of rediscovers the beauty of Chenin Blanc from the Loire Valley. The grape itself, some of its sort of lack of success globally has to do with just the fact that it can be a little bit temperamental. It's a thin-skinned variety, and again, when we talked about things like Nebbiolo and Pinot Noir earlier, those are reds, but some of the same holds true with whites. One of the challenges with thin-skinned varieties is that they do tend to be difficult to grow, or they're at least subject to a lot of disease issues, rot, and things like that. And while the thin skin nature can be actually beneficial with something like botrytis, where you can get more botrytis effect if that's what you're looking for the most part, it does mean that the grapes themselves are a little more fragile. It's also requires a really long growing season. It buds quite early and ripens quite late. There's an interesting kind of set of dynamics that go to work here. So one of them is you need conditions that are both beneficial at the beginning of the growing season. So you can't have too much cold weather, frost, hail, et cetera, early in the growing season, because the vines have already budded relatively early. So they're kind of potentially at risk in that early part of the growing season. And they need to be able to maintain sort of desirable conditions all the way through a later ripening for a white grape. It's not super late compared to reds, but you definitely need to have a long growing season. And the other part of that I think is really interesting and maybe isn't as thought about is if you move to growing Chenin Blanc in warmer places, and this is what's happened in California, as people have looked to make really high quality Chenin Blanc in California, they found that a lot of the places it was planted for sort of bulk wine production, for growing a lot of it quickly. And the problem is when you compress the growing season to the point where you're ripening the grape really fast, you don't get what I talked about at the beginning. You don't get this balance of high acidity and a lot of complexity. You get high acidity if you pick it really early, but very little complexity. Or if you wait for the complexity to kind of develop in the grapes, you end up with this really kind of overripe, flabby, kind of rich style that just isn't necessarily all that enjoyable. I don't think. It goes into bulk wine, which, I mean, there's a place for it for sure, but it's not necessarily what we're going to be talking about on Disgorged Online. So, like I said, there's this interesting challenges with the viticulture of it. And also, interestingly, it's one of these varieties that is very rarely blended other than in bulk wine. So you'll almost never find a bottle that is going to be a blend of Chenin Blanc and something else, other than some people doing some experimentation in places like, the US and whatnot. But classically in France, all the appellations where you would find Chenin Blanc are going to be 100% Chenin Blanc. And beyond that, you're not likely to find it even in the other producing regions. Most of the time, it'll be 100%. So as I was mentioning, with Vouvray, there's a range of sweetness levels from dry, which will usually be labeled as sec, S-E-C, to a sort of semi-sweet style, which might be labeled as demi-sec, and then a really sweet style, which is really kind of hard to find these days, especially in the US, but that is labeled as moyu. There's also a lot of sparkling Vouvray out there. It can be really, really delicious, actually. Most of it is made in the traditional methods, so with a secondary fermentation in the bottle, and those can be quite tasty. There's also, you can find some Cremant de Loire that's also made from Chenin Blanc, although that will be made outside of the appellation of Vouvray, of course, because if it was in Vouvray, they would probably call it Vouvray. Within Vouvray itself, there's a few producers. So in addition to the Domaine Pichot, which I'm drinking here, and I will show again, there's a few producers that I particularly like. Domaine Huet, H-U-E-T, is probably the most highly regarded and best known. And they produce not only sort of a general Vouvray, but a few single vineyard Vouvrays that can be really tasty. The one that I carried at Dahlia Lounge back when that was open was Francois Pinon, P-I-N-O-N, and their Silex Noir. So Silex, S-I-L-E-X. Those of you on YouTube can read the word in Mindy's comment there about what she's drinking, is this really interesting soil type that I'll talk about in a minute. But that is a really interesting soil type in not just in Vouvray, but in some various parts of the Loire Valley. And then Francois Chidane, C-H-I-D-A-I-N-E. And that is they produce both some really tasty still, but also really, really one of my probably favorite sparkling Vouvrays that's out there. And so I was mentioning a little bit about geology, and I'll just dive into this for just a moment. So a lot of the great Chenin Blanc production in the Loire, in fact, almost all of it, is based on limestone soils, in particular something called tuffeau, which is also base material for a lot of the chateaux that were built. Unsurprisingly, it's quite common in the Loire, especially in the sort of part of it that is devoted to Chenin Blanc. But there is this other soil type that's called silex, which is basically slate, and that often overlays the limestone. And that is, I think, a particularly interesting site because, as we talked about, again, there's a lot of connections to Riesling because there's some similarities in sort of the growing and where the best sites are. But when you have that slate overlaying the limestone, you get these two kind of really cool effects. So on the one hand, you get this real benefit of limestone, which would be that wines that are grown on limestone soil tend to be really high in acid, but the silex or the slate acts as a sort of radiator during the growing season, in particular in the evenings as it's cooling off. It helps keep the vines and the grapes warm. It helps promote a little bit more ripening. So it gets the grapes to just a slightly higher degree of ripeness and complexity. And I find that to be really appealing. So that's always something to look out for if you're looking at, not that every single wine that's made on silex soil in Vouvray is going to be great, but it's definitely something to keep an eye out for. And then I mentioned there are some other places in the Loire that are also really good. So probably the second most famous region is Savinière, which, as I mentioned, is to the west. But really the place that I found that I really enjoy is, just because it's a little bit less well-known at this point, although I think that's slowly changing, is Saumur. And there are three producers in particular that I would highlight to keep an eye out for if you like these kinds of wines. So one thing about the wines from Saumur is they're more traditionally quite dry. There's not a lot of off-dry styles there. So you are going to get more sort of acidity, or not more acidity, but more sort of dry structure, a little bit less residual sugar, although sometimes there's a little bit to kind of carry the wine. So Arnaud Lambert is probably my favorite producer, and in particular the Clos de Midi, which is off of the hill of Brezay. So actually all three of these producers I'm going to mention have Brezay at their heart. There's a very famous chateau there. His winery used to be called Chateau de Brezay until there was basically, I guess, the threat of a lawsuit. The people who operate the chateau as a sort of historic monument and a place to go visit threatened to sue him, and he said, okay, well, fine, I'll put my own name on the wine instead. But that area is really beautiful. And one of the cool things about it is it's actually one of the few places in Saumur, the hill of Brezay, that's actually limestone. So as I mentioned, this great connection with limestone and Chenin Blanc. It's not super common in Saumur. So this area of Brezay is kind of the one place where they can make this style of Chenin Blanc. And then Domaine Guiberteau, which is a producer who's definitely gotten some attention of late. They do some interesting things, including actually aging some of their Chenin Blancs in a decent amount of new oak, which is uncommon, but In this case, I think actually works really well. Again, these wines have so much acidity that the oak helps kind of soften the wines a touch in a way that sugar might for a different producer, but they want to make dry styles of wine. They just want to kind of keep it, really, really dry, but add some body through the use of oak. And then Brendan Stater West. So definitely not a French name, you might notice. But Brendan is actually the winemaker at Domaine Guy Berthaud. He's actually from Oregon, but ended up through a series of events in Brezé making wine with Romain Guy Berthaud, and now has his own label as well. And his wines are a little bit more classically styled, actually, interestingly, despite the fact that he's the American, he's making wines in a more kind of classically Loire Valley style, and Domaine Guy Berthaud's are a little more iconoclastic in terms of their use of oak and things like that. The last thing I'll say about Loire Valley, Chenin Blanc, and before we move on to some talk about pairings, is that there is also these two great appellations for sweet and dessert style wines. And I know that dessert wines are not really what most people are interested in these days. And even I mean, I like them, but they're not something that we drink here at home very often. It's just rare that that's what I want a lot of. But should you be ever in the position where you want to try something really kind of special, or we're in a place in time when you can actually share a bottle of wine with more than one or two people, dessert wines can be a really fun way to explore something. And so Bonnezeau, and then in particular Côte de Chaume, are these two appellations in the Saumur region and Anjou region that are kind of just amazing. They have these sort of honey, ginger, complex, almost marmalade character, along with all this acidity. And I think they can go toe-to-toe with the other great botrytis-sized dessert wines of France, like Sauternes. And they're often quite a bit less expensive. They're also a little tricky to find. You'll find them in the US if you look, but they're definitely not widely available. It's not like you're going to walk into your local grocery store and find really much dessert wine, of course, but certainly not these wines. But something to keep an eye out for, or to think about going forward. So before I wrap things up by talking a little bit about some pairings, just of course, reminder, if you have any questions, let me know. You can throw them on the YouTube chat or on Instagram. I will get to them probably after I finish this, because I have not figured out how to do both at the same time. And then I'm still formulating a plan for after this coming Wednesday, which will be the last of this sort of series of 12 classes and videos. Don't worry, there will be more content coming. We're not anywhere near getting out of this stay-at-home order here in Washington, so I got to do something. Hopefully you all have enjoyed this. And like I said, if you have any questions or suggestions for going forward, feel free to throw them. You can mention them in the comments here. You can find me on social media. You can email me at zach@disgorgedwine.com and send those along. So like I said, finish up with some pairing ideas. I find that Chenin Blanc, and I'll kind of divide this really quick to sort of drier and sweeter styles, because there's a little bit of a different answer here. The drier styles, I think, work really beautifully with a lot of shellfish, things like crab and lobster in particular, but also even things like shrimp. I wouldn't go with necessarily like raw oysters. I don't think these wines have that sort of salty, briny character that I would want to pair with that, but anything that's cooked is going to work really beautifully. I also find that really dry styles of Chenin work beautifully with a lot of like sushi. So not just cooked fish, but a lot of the sort of raw fish can go really beautifully as well. On the slightly sweeter side, like the one I'm drinking, I find this to be one of my absolute favorite styles of wine to have with cheese. It can be a really young, like fresh goat's milk cheese, as is common in the Loire. It can be a firmer cheese with a little bit of nuttiness, because again, you get that oxidative character in the wine. That nuttiness in the wine will play really nicely with that. And this is also a really beautiful style of wine to match with a really kind of stinky, soft cheese with some age on it. Again, there's something about the slight sweetness in the wine that will help kind of soften that funk of the cheese, and the acidity though will also keep the richness of those cheeses from feeling out of whack. So like I said, hopefully this is giving you a little bit of enthusiasm if you didn't already have it for Chenin Blanc, one of my favorite varieties, and I think really a wine and a variety that deserves to have a bigger place on the global wine stage. We'll see if that happens over time. So thank you again for joining me on Disgorged Online. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Saturday, and I will see you back here on Wednesday. Cheers.